This is a great question. I think it's an important question. Is all of the Bible about Christ? Well, obviously there are specific parts of the Bible, individual parts of it that aren't specifically about Jesus. I think it's the wrong question. I think the greater question is what is the point of the Bible? And the point of the Bible is clearly God's promise to redeem, Revelation 21:5, the recovery of all things. We know that's going on in the Bible. God declares in Genesis 3 to crush the head of a serpent, and not long after that, it's underway, and the promise to Abraham. And I think what a lot of people struggle with is that they go into passages looking for Christ, and they turn stones into some spiritual principle or, those kind of things, kind of a typological approach to interpretation. You end up reading things into passages that aren't there. I think that's a mistake. And I think the story reads better when you read the Bible as God fulfilling the promise that He made to Abraham and to mankind to redeem from the consequence of the fall. And so the very specific events that you find in the Old Testament, you don't have to read into. It's just obvious that it's a part of that story, that unfolding of what God did. God is the subject, not man. And Christ is the climax, not the characters in the Bible. So when you get to the story like David and Goliath, and you're trying to figure out what that story is about, typically what we do is we celebrate David, his virtue, his character. Well, look, I know men that are more virtuous than David because they've never committed adultery. They've never killed someone to cover it up. They've been married to the same person. So it's obviously not the character of David. It's not the virtue of David. When you look at a scene like David and Goliath, and you're trying to figure out what that's all about, what you need to do is freeze that story where the stone is over the desert on its way to Goliath, and realize that that stone, which hits that fighting champion in the forehead and takes him down, is God fulfilling His promise to redeem His name through the recovery and redemption of sinners. And David is relevant. And the fact of the matter is, David could have been anybody, and there was no way David was going to miss Goliath. The reason he had 5 stones is not because Goliath necessarily had 4 brothers. It was because David didn't trust his own accuracy. David has a more biblical opinion of David than we have of David, so to speak. But God, through the prophet Samuel, had anointed David king. And through David would come a king who would conquer all men. And every knee would bow, every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. So the promise comes through David. So there's no way David misses. David could have turned around backwards, covered his eyes with the right hand, and thrown left-handed over his shoulder. And Goliath would have gone down. And I think that's the way that you read the Bible. And you don't have to look for Christ in every nook and cranny. Just understand that every little bit of history is bringing us to Christ. Sometimes it's at 30,000 feet in a history and a collection of events like the book of Numbers. And sometimes it focuses in on an individual like David or like Joshua or like Joseph. But all of those events are bringing us to the cross ultimately. And so we look back on it, but we read the history moving forward. So we don't have to spiritualize, it's real history. What we get to celebrate constantly as believers is what God has done. And there's a real sense in which, historically and literally, that stone over the desert is intricately tied to my redemption. Because if Israel is conquered and David dies, there is no Messiah into the story, right? So I think that's how you read the story rightly about Jesus without reading into the story things that aren't actually there. It kind of saves us. So we get to enjoy the history of the Bible as it is literally there as God is fulfilling the things that occurred. And it's a way to kind of tear down the flannel board of our youthful education in church and understand the Bible in a completely different way.